The violent hiss of steam valves mixed with the sharp clang of metal hitting concrete echoed through the industrial laundry facility at Fort Clay. "Take that uniform off right now!" Lieutenant Blake Harrison's voice cut through the humid air like a blade at 0600 hours. His face flushed with the kind of righteous anger that only came from catching someone in what he considered a grave offense. Grace Miller stood perfectly still in the center of the massive laundry room, her 45-year-old frame neither defensive nor apologetic. The woodland camouflage uniform she wore had seen better days. The pattern from 2003, colors faded from years of washing, a small patch near the left shoulder where fabric had been carefully mended. Her brown hair, streaked with premature gray, was pulled back in a regulation bun that seemed out of place for someone who spent her days surrounded by industrial washing machines and the acrid smell of military-grade detergent. Her hands, weathered and marked by chemical burns from years of handling harsh cleaning agents, rested calmly at her sides. Around her, the morning shift had come to a complete halt. 20 people, young soldiers picking up their cleaned uniforms, civilian contractors loading machines, even a few NCOs grabbing coffee from the break room, all turned to witness the confrontation. The rhythmic churning of washing machines created an oddly tense soundtrack to the scene. "You have no right to wear the uniform of the United States military." Harrison stepped closer, his West Point ring catching the fluorescent lights. His pressed ACUs looked factory new compared to Grace's worn attire. "You're a laundry technician. This is stolen valor. This is disrespecting every real soldier who earned the right to wear this." Grace's eyes moved slowly from Harrison's face to the pile of uniforms she'd been processing. Blood-stained ACUs from wounded warriors just transferred from Walter Reed Medical Center. Dark patches of dried blood marked where tourniquets had been applied, where medics had cut through fabric to save lives. She said nothing, simply turning back to her work, lifting another bloodied uniform with the kind of reverence reserved for folding a flag. "I'm talking to you!" Harrison's voice rose another octave. Behind him, 5 young soldiers had begun to gather, drawn by the drama like moths to flame. Private Rodriguez, built like a linebacker with arms that strained against his uniform sleeves, laughed loud enough for everyone to hear. "Yo, who does Grandma think she is, playing dress-up?" But in exactly 20 minutes, when superheated steam would turn this orderly facility into a nightmare of scalding vapor and panic, they would understand why this quiet woman had kept her old uniform for 20 years, and why some warriors never truly leave the battlefield. If watching someone who serves in silence get publicly humiliated makes your blood boil, if you believe that not all heroes wear their medals on display, then hit that like button right now. Subscribe and ring the notification bell, because what's about to unfold will completely transform how you see the invisible heroes walking among us. And if you want to support more stories about hidden strength and quiet service, that thanks button below helps me continue this mission of revealing truth through storytelling. The morning had started like any other for Grace Miller. She'd arrived at 0530 hours, 30 minutes before her shift officially began, just as she had every day for the past 5 years. The industrial laundry facility at Fort Clay processed over 500 uniforms daily, everything from basic ACUs to dress blues, but Grace always started with the same task, the bloodied uniforms from the medical transports. Rodriguez moved to block her path as she tried to return to her station, his 220 pounds of muscle creating an intimidating wall. "Hey, I asked you a question. You deaf or just stupid?" He looked back at his buddies for approval, getting encouraging nods from the growing crowd. Specialist Chen had her phone out, already live streaming to her 3,000 followers. "Oh my God, you guys have to see this," she narrated, with the kind of cruel excitement that social media had turned into currency. "We got ourselves a wannabe veteran alert. This cleaning lady really thought she could just throw on a uniform and pretend to be one of us." Grace carefully folded the bloodied uniform she was holding, using the same precise military corners she'd been using long before any of these young soldiers had been born. Her movements were economical, practiced, each fold exactly 8 inches, creating perfect rectangles that would make any drill sergeant nod in approval. She placed it gently in the special care pile, uniforms that belonged to Purple Heart recipients, requiring extra attention to remove blood while preserving the dignity of what they represented. "That uniform isn't even regulation anymore," Private First Class Martinez chimed in, his technical knowledge his only claim to authority in the group. "That woodland pattern was phased out in 2005. Where'd you even get this? Army surplus store? eBay? He circled Grace like a prosecutor examining evidence, pointing out every non-standard element. Look at those boots. Old style. Probably picked them up at a thrift shop. Specialist Thompson, wiry and mean with the kind of small man complex that manifested in petty cruelties, accidentally knocked over Grace's cart of cleaning supplies. Industrial strength detergent splattered across the floor, the sharp chemical smell immediately filling the air. "Oops," he said with mock innocence. "Guess you better clean that up. That's what you're good at, right? Cleaning up after real soldiers?" Private Walker, newer to the group but eager to fit in, pulled out his phone to call security. "I'm reporting this. This is probably illegal, right? Impersonating military personnel? My dad said people go to jail for this." His voice carried the uncertainty of someone who wasn't quite sure of his facts, but was committed to the performance. The crowd had grown to 30 people now, a mixture of expressions ranging from amusement to discomfort. Some laughed openly, others shifted uneasily, and a few watched with the kind of careful attention that suggested they were seeing something the others were missing. Grace continued working, her silence more provocative than any response could have been. It was the silence that seemed to infuriate Harrison the most. He was used to confrontation, to people defending themselves, making excuses, or backing down. Grace did none of these things. She simply continued her work, handling each bloodied uniform with the same careful attention, checking labels for special instructions, pre-treating stains with a precision that seemed almost medical. "Sergeant Barnes!" Harrison called out, as a stocky NCO entered the facility for his morning pickup. "Sergeant, we have a situation here. This civilian is wearing a military uniform without authorization." Barnes, 15 years in service with 2 deployments to Afghanistan, looked from Harrison to Grace, then to the crowd of soldiers that had formed a semicircle around the confrontation. His weathered face showed the exhaustion of someone who'd seen too much actual conflict to be impressed by garrison drama. "What's the problem, Lieutenant?" "This laundry technician," Harrison gestured dismissively at Grace, "is wearing a military uniform. It's stolen valor, Sergeant. She needs to remove it immediately or face charges." Barnes studied Grace more carefully now. Something in her posture, the way she held herself despite being surrounded, triggered a memory he couldn't quite place. But the pressure of 30 watching eyes and a lieutenant's direct statement pushed him toward the path of least resistance. "Ma'am, you need to remove that uniform. It's against federal law to impersonate military personnel." Grace finally looked up, meeting Barnes's eyes directly. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, controlled, with the kind of measured cadence that came from years of having to be heard over engines and alarms. "I need 15 minutes to finish processing these uniforms from Walter Reed, Sergeant. They belong to wounded warriors. Their families are coming today." Her use of military time, the way she said sergeant, with just the right amount of respect, the specific reference to wounded warriors, small details that Barnes filed away even as Harrison's face grew redder. "15 minutes, Harrison almost shouted. "You don't get 15 minutes. You take that uniform off now or I'm calling the MPs. "Look at her," Rodriguez laughed, pointing at Grace's hands as they sorted uniforms. "Her hands are shaking. Probably scared out of her mind." But Elena, another laundry worker who'd been silent until now, saw what Rodriguez missed. Grace's hands weren't shaking from fear. They moved with the kind of micro-tremor that came from years of handling hot metal and dealing with nerve damage, occupational hazards that Elena had seen before in very specific circumstances. "Just leave her alone," Elena said quietly, but her voice was drowned out by Chen's continuing narration to her phone. "The stolen valor is real, people. Look at this woman. Probably never served a day in her life, trying to get military discounts or something. This is so disrespectful to those of us who actually earned our uniforms." Chen moved closer, making sure to get Grace's face in frame. The live stream comments were pouring in, a mixture of support for the soldiers and a few questioning voices wondering why someone would wear an old worn uniform if they were trying to steal valor. Grace reached into one of the washing machines, pulling out a set of ACUs that bore the distinctive marks of field trauma, the kind of stains that told stories of IEDs and medics working desperately to save lives. She handled them with the same care a curator might show to historical artifacts, checking each piece before beginning the careful process of restoration. "You know what?" Thompson said, his voice taking on a nastier edge. "I bet she's one of those protesters, wearing the uniform to make some kind of statement." He moved closer to Grace's workstation, where a small personal shelf held her belongings. A worn photo frame sat next to a thermos of coffee, and before anyone could stop him, Thompson grabbed it. The photo showed a younger Grace standing with a group of people in military uniforms, their faces blurred by time and handling, but their postures unmistakably military. Thompson held it up mockingly. "Oh, look, she's got fake photos too, probably photoshopped herself in." Grace moved then, faster than anyone expected from a middle-aged laundry worker. Her hand closed over Thompson's wrist with a grip that made him yelp, and dropped the photo. She caught it before it hit the ground. The movement so smooth it seemed choreographed. For a moment, the mask slipped and something else showed through. Training, capability, danger, carefully controlled. "Don't touch that," she said quietly. "Away," and Thompson stepped back involuntarily, rubbing his wrist. The photo went back on the shelf, and Grace returned to her work as if nothing had happened. The moment passed quickly, but several people noticed. Barnes' eyes narrowed slightly. One of the older civilian workers, a Vietnam veteran named Carl who operated the pressing machines, stood a little straighter. Even Harrison hesitated for a moment before his anger reasserted itself. "That's assault," Walker exclaimed, still recording. "She just assaulted Thompson. This is all on video." But Thompson, still rubbing his wrist, shook his head quickly. He'd felt the controlled bore in that grip, the way she'd applied exactly enough pressure to make him release without causing actual damage. It was technique, not anger. "No, it's fine. I'm fine." The industrial laundry facility's environment itself seemed to be picking up on the tension. The massive boiler system that powered the steam presses groaned slightly, a sound that Grace's head immediately turned toward. She looked at the pressure gauges mounted on the far wall, noting readings that others ignored. The morning shift had been running the equipment hard, trying to process a backlog from the weekend. And the system was showing signs of stress that only someone intimately familiar with industrial equipment would recognize. Do you notice something different about how Grace handles this situation? There's a reason she won't defend herself with words, only actions. Comment below if you've figured out her secret. Share this video with anyone who's ever been underestimated. They need to see what happens when assumptions meet reality. The details coming next will make you want to re-watch from the beginning. "Captain Morris is on his way," Harrison announced with satisfaction. Having made a call on his phone, he'll sort this out, and when he does, you'll be facing federal charges for impersonating military personnel. Grace continued working, but her movements had subtly changed. She was positioning herself closer to the emergency shut-off valves, her eyes tracking the increasing pressure readings that everyone else continued to ignore. The warning lights on the boiler system had begun flashing yellow. Not yet critical, but heading there. She'd seen this pattern before, in much more dangerous circumstances, where missing the early warning signs meant catastrophe. Martinez, still trying to impress the group with his technical knowledge, pointed at Grace's uniform again. "Look at the way she's wearing it, though. Name tape's in the right place, badges positioned correctly. Someone taught her how to wear it properly at least." "YouTube tutorials," Cheney said dismissively, still streaming. "You can learn anything online these days. How to fake being a veteran, how to get sympathy and respect you didn't earn." Captain Morris arrived then, his presence immediately changing the dynamic in the room. A 20-year career officer with combat deployments to both Iraq and Afghanistan, Morris had the kind of bearing that made even comfortable situations feel like inspections. He surveyed the scene with obvious irritation. This was supposed to be a simple Monday morning, not a circus. "What's the situation here, Lieutenant?" His voice carried the weariness of someone who had dealt with too much petty garrison drama. "Sir, this civilian employee is wearing a military uniform without authorization. She refuses to remove it despite multiple direct orders. I believe this constitutes stolen valor and recommend immediate action." Morris looked at Grace, taking in the worn uniform. The careful way she continued working, despite being the center of attention, the industrial laundry facility that had been her workplace for 5 years. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to remove that uniform immediately. This is government property, and wearing it without authorization is a federal offense. You can either comply now, or I'll have security escort you off base and you'll face criminal charges." Grace looked up at Morris, and for the first time, there was something like emotion in her eyes. Not fear or anger, but a deep, bone-weary sadness. "Captain, I just need to finish this load." These uniforms, she gestured to the bloodied ACUs, they belong to kids who got hit by an IED 3 days ago outside Kandahar. Their families are coming for them today. The blood needs to be removed properly, with dignity. Give me 10 minutes, sir. The way she said it, the specific military terminology, the geographical reference that sounded like personal knowledge rather than news reports, the use of sir in that particular military cadence, it all added up to something that made Morris pause. But the pressure of 40 people watching, recording, waiting for authority to assert itself, pushed him forward. Ma'am, I understand you want to finish your work, but Grace's emergency response kit contained professional-grade thermal protection equipment and specialized breathing apparatus designed for industrial hazard situations, featuring military specification heat resistance up to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. She kept it within arm's reach at all times, a habit from years of training that civilians mistook for over-preparation. That kit would prove its worth in less than 5 minutes. The first sign of real trouble came as a deep rumble through the floor, felt more than heard. Grace's head snapped up immediately, her body already moving toward the emergency controls. Others felt it too, but dismissed it as normal industrial noise. The pressure gauges that Grace had been watching were now deep in the red zone. Everyone needs to move away from the main boiler line, Grace said, her voice carrying a command authority that made several people involuntarily step back. Now she's giving orders? Harrison laughed, but it was forced. Something in Grace's tone, the absolute certainty of danger, had penetrated even his anger. The pressure release valve is failing, Grace continued, already moving toward the manual override. If it blows at current pressure, the steam will. The explosion cut her off. Not the main boiler, that would have leveled the building, but the primary pressure release valve, designed to prevent exactly that catastrophe. It failed in the worst possible way. Not releasing pressure, but redirecting it into the facility's internal steam system. The result was instantaneous and terrifying. Superheated steam, nearly 200 degrees Fahrenheit, erupted from every vent, pipe joint, and seal in the room. Visibility dropped to 0 in seconds. The temperature spiked so fast that condensation immediately formed on every surface, turning the industrial laundry facility into a scalding sauna. Alarms blared, emergency lights flashed, but they were useless in the opaque white cloud that had swallowed everything. Screams erupted from every direction. 40 people, including trained soldiers, suddenly found themselves blind, disoriented, and facing potentially fatal burns if they moved in the wrong direction. The exits, so clearly marked moments ago, were now invisible. The metal fixtures that could guide them to safety were too hot to touch. Harrison's voice, so commanding moments before, cracked with panic. I can't see. Where's the exit? Rodriguez, for all his physical strength, had pressed himself against what he thought was a wall, but was actually moving closer to the source of the steam. Chen had dropped her phone, her live stream still running, but showing only white chaos and the sounds of terror. But through the chaos, one voice cut clear and commanding, pitched to carry over alarms and panic. Everyone down! Now! Get on your bellies and crawl to the walls! It was Grace, and the authority in her voice was so absolute that even in their panic, people obeyed. This wasn't the quiet laundry worker anymore. This was someone who had faced worse chaos and survived. Stay below 3 feet. The steam rises. Follow the walls to your right. That leads to the exit. Do not stand up. Do not run. Grace herself was already moving, but not toward the exit. She went deeper into the steam, toward the manual override valves that were the only way to stop this before someone died. The route would take her directly through the densest, hottest part of the steam cloud. What happened next would be captured partially on Chen's dropped phone, the audio telling a story that the whiteout video couldn't show. The sound of Grace moving with purpose through the chaos, calling out positioning to guide others. Martinez, 5 feet to your left. Thompson, you're going the wrong way. Turn around. Barnes, get them out. I've got the valves. She navigated blind through an obstacle course of industrial equipment using memory and trained instinct. The sequential shutdown of steam valves had to be done in exact order. Wrong sequence and the pressure backup could cause a main boiler explosion that would level half the building. It was a procedure taught in naval damage control training, specific to ship engineering casualties where one wrong move meant losing the entire vessel. Grace's hands found the first valve, the metal so hot it would have burned anyone who touched it without protection. But her scarred hands, already damaged from old burns, worked through the pain. 3 full turns counterclockwise, then move to the secondary bypass, 2 turns only, then the tertiary release. Each movement precise, despite zero visibility, despite the screaming chaos around her, despite the fact that every second meant more risk of someone dying in the steam. Those still conscious could hear her working, the screech of metal on metal, as valves that hadn't been manually operated in years were forced to turn. Harrison, flat on his belly, and crawling toward where he hoped the exit was, heard her counting under her breath. Not in English, but in the kind of number sequences damage control teams use to track procedures under stress. The steam began to dissipate, not all at once but in stages, as Grace systematically redirected the pressure, venting it external rather than internal, cooling the system in phases to prevent thermal shock to the pipes. It was a delicate balance that required not just knowledge but experience, the kind that came from doing this for real, when lives depended on it. As visibility began to return, shapes emerged from the white chaos. People pressed against walls, some crawling toward exits, others huddled in groups. And in the center of it all, Grace stood at the manual control station, her uniform torn in multiple places from catching on equipment, her hands still on the final valve. The back of her uniform had ripped completely, exposing her upper back. That's when everyone saw it. The tattoo was intricate, professional military work, not something done in a civilian parlor. A phoenix rising from flames, its wings spread across her shoulder blades, each feather detailed with an artist's precision. But beneath the phoenix, etched in stark black letters across the middle of her back, were words that made Sergeant Barnes gasp audibly. USS Liberty Dawn, Phoenix Team, Engine Room Angels. Barnes knew that name. Everyone who'd served in the Navy between 2000 and 2005 knew that name. The Liberty Dawn fire was taught in damage control schools as the miracle that shouldn't have been possible. An engine room explosion that should have killed everyone below decks, saved by one chief petty officer who went back into the flames 7 times. Holy cow. Barnes couldn't finish the sentence. Captain Morris, helping evacuate people, saw the tattoo and physically staggered. His face went white beneath the sheen of sweat and condensation. But it was the arrival of base emergency responders that created the moment that would be replayed millions of times on social media. The fire chief, a former Navy man himself, took one look at the scene. The controlled shutdown, the systematic valve configuration, the fact that no one was seriously injured despite what could have been a catastrophe, and asked the question, who performed the emergency protocol? Every finger pointed to Grace. Ma'am, that was textbook naval damage control. Where did you... He stopped mid-sentence as he saw the tattoo. His entire demeanor changed. Chief Miller, Grace Miller, you're the Liberty Dawn chief? The silence that followed was deafening. Even the alarm seemed to quiet for a moment. Chen fumbled for her phone, the live stream still running, now capturing something entirely different than the stolen valor confrontation she'd started with. Harrison stood frozen, his uniform soaked with condensation, his earlier rage replaced by something approaching shock. Rodriguez had helped Thompson to his feet, both of them staring at Grace with expressions that mixed confusion and dawning realization. But it was the arrival of Commander Patterson that created the moment no one would forget. The base commander had been in a meeting when the emergency alert came through. He'd run from the headquarters building, arriving just as the emergency responders were finishing their initial assessment. He was 62 years old, silver-haired, with the kind of presence that came from 40 years of service in combat command. He pushed through the crowd, demanding answers, until he saw Grace standing by the emergency controls, her torn uniform revealing the Phoenix tattoo. Patterson stopped so abruptly that his aide nearly ran into him. His face went through a series of expressions: recognition, disbelief, and then something that looked almost like pain. "Chief Miller," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, then louder, "Chief Grace Miller." Grace turned to face him, and for the first time since the morning's confrontation began, she showed emotion. A small, sad smile crossed her face. "Hello, Commander. It's been a long time." 20 years, Patterson said, his voice thick with something that sounded like unshed tears. 20 years since you pulled me out of that engine room. The entire facility went silent. Even those still recovering from the steam incident stopped to watch this exchange. "I was just doing my job, sir," Grace said quietly. "Your job?" Patterson's voice cracked. "You went into a burning engine room 7 times. You saved 37 sailors. You saved me last, even though you were already badly burned. I was unconscious, trapped under debris. Any rational person would have left me to save themselves. But you came back." He took a step forward, and then, in front of 40 witnesses, in violation of every protocol about military bearing and proper conduct, Commander Patterson, base commander, decorated veteran, man who'd led soldiers in 3 different wars, started to drop to one knee. "Don't!" Grace said sharply, moving forward to stop him. "Don't you dare, Patterson. Not for doing what anyone else would have done." "Anyone else wouldn't have done it," Patterson said, allowing her to help him stay standing, but gripping her burned hands in his. "That's why there's only one Phoenix team chief. That's why the Navy tried to give you the Medal of Honor." "Which I refused," Grace reminded him. "I was just doing—" "Your job, I know." Patterson's smile was watery. "It's what you always said. But Grace, what are you doing here? In my base's laundry facility? You disappeared after the Liberty Dawn. The Navy said you were medically retired, but no one knew where you went." Grace gently extracted her hands from his grip and gestured to the bloodied uniform she'd been working on. "Still doing my job, Commander, just a different battlefield." She picked up one of the ACUs, the bloodstains now properly treated and ready for the gentle cycle that would remove them without damaging the fabric. "These belong to Private First Class Williams, 19 years old, hit by an IED 4 days ago, lost his left leg below the knee. His mother is flying in from Ohio today to see him. She doesn't need to see her son's blood on his uniform. The moment that will go viral starts now. Share this before you watch what happens next. Your friends won't believe who this quiet woman really is. Tag anyone who's ever judged someone by their appearance. And if you've served or know someone who has, comment below to honor the quiet heroes like Grace who continue serving long after their official service ends." Patterson looked around the facility, taking in the industrial washers, the pressing stations, the carts of uniforms waiting for treatment. Then he looked at the people who'd witnessed the morning's events. Harrison, still in shock. Rodriguez, unable to meet Grace's eyes. Chen, whose phone was still recording everything. Martinez, Thompson, Walker, all looking like they had been hit by a physical blow. 5 years, Patterson said slowly. "You've been here 5 years, and I never knew. You've been washing blood out of uniforms, serving the wounded, and none of us knew we had a genuine hero in our midst." "Not a hero," Grace corrected firmly. "Just someone who knows what blood costs and wanted to help carry that burden in whatever small way I could." She moved back to her workstation, beginning to sort the uniforms that had been scattered during the chaos. "My husband came back from Iraq with PTSD in 2005. Good man, strong Marine, but the war broke something inside him. I retired to take care of him, but he needed purpose, needed to still serve somehow. So, we came here. He volunteers at the Veterans Hospital, helps other combat vets process their trauma. I wash their uniforms. We both serve in our own way." Barnes found his voice. "The Liberty Dawn fire, they teach it at every damage control school in the Navy. The impossible save. 7 entries into a burning compartment, 0 visibility, toxic smoke. You're the reason they changed the entire protocol for engine room casualties." "They changed it because the old protocol would have let 37 sailors die," Grace replied, checking the pressure settings on one of the washers. "Sometimes regulations have to give way to necessity." Harrison finally managed to speak, though his voice came out as barely more than a croak. We didn't know." Grace looked at him, and there was no anger in her eyes, just a kind of tired understanding. "Why would you? I'm just the woman who washes your uniforms. That's all I've been for 5 years, and that's all I wanted to be." She paused, then added, "That uniform you wanted me to take off? It's mine, properly earned, properly discharged. I wear it once a year, on the anniversary of the Liberty Dawn fire, to remember the ones who didn't make it out. Today is that anniversary." Rodriguez's face crumpled. "We called you. I said you were—" "You said I was playing dress-up," Grace finished for him. "You weren't entirely wrong. I am playing dress-up, in a way. Dressing up as the person I used to be, to honor the people who can't dress up anymore." She pulled out a small notebook from her pocket, water-damaged and worn. "Petty Officer James Rodriguez, 22, from San Antonio, engine room tech, loved baseball, had a girlfriend named Maria. He was going to propose when we got back to port." Rodriguez staggered backward. That was my Uncle Jimmy. He died in the Liberty Dawn fire. My mom, he He stopped, unable to continue. Grace nodded. I know. I remember every one of them. 21 sailors died that day. I saved 37, but I lost 21. I know their names, their faces, their stories. Your uncle died trying to shut down the fuel lines, preventing an even bigger explosion. He's the reason I could get to the others. He's a hero. Chen had lowered her phone, the live stream forgotten. My followers. They're going crazy. The video's already at 50,000 views. They're calling you the Phoenix Chief. Someone found old Navy photos, reports about the Liberty Dawn. You're famous. You're a legend. I'm a laundry worker, Grace corrected. Have been for 5 years, plan to be for as long as they'll let me. This, she gestured to the facility, this is where I'm needed now. Thompson, still rubbing his wrist where Grace had grabbed him, asked quietly, when you stopped me from touching your photo? Training, Gracie said simply. 20 years of muscle memory doesn't just go away. I'm sorry if I hurt you. You didn't, Thompson said quickly. You could have. I could feel it. You could have broken my wrist without even trying, but you didn't. Captain Morris had been silent throughout the exchange, processing everything he had witnessed. Finally, he spoke. Chief Miller, I owe you an apology. Not just for today, but for every day you've been here, serving without recognition, without anyone knowing what you'd done, what you'd sacrificed. I didn't want recognition, Grace replied. I wanted purpose. There's a difference. She turned to address everyone in the room. Every uniform that comes through here tells a story. Blood, sweat, tears, they all leave marks. My job is to clean those marks, to give these warriors fresh starts, clean slates. It's not heroic, it's necessary. Someone has to do it, and I'm good at it. Walker, the youngest of the group who had wanted to call security, stepped forward hesitantly. Chief Miller, could you teach us? The damage control procedures you used? They're not in any manual I've studied. Grace considered this. They're not in manuals because they're based on experience, not theory. But yes, if Captain Morris approves, I could run some training sessions. This base has similar steam systems in 3 other buildings. If this, she gestured to the damaged valve system, happens again, you need people who know how to respond. Morris nodded immediately. Absolutely. Chief Miller, I'm officially requesting you conduct emergency response training for all base personnel. Your expertise... He paused, then continued. We've had a Medal of Honor recipient washing our uniforms for 5 years and never knew it. I told you, I refused the medal, Grace reminded him. You refused it, but they awarded it anyway, Patterson interjected. It's been sitting in a Pentagon vault for 20 years, waiting for you to claim it, along with the Navy Cross, 3 Bronze Stars, and a Purple Heart from the burns you sustained. The information rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. Elena, who had tried to defend Grace earlier, was crying openly. Carl, the Vietnam veteran who ran the pressing station, had stood at attention since the Phoenix tattoo was revealed. Grace looked uncomfortable with the attention, the same way she'd been uncomfortable with Harrison's anger earlier. Both extremes of recognition seemed equally unwelcome. She turned back to her work, lifting another bloodied uniform, this one with a name tape reading, Anderson. Private Anderson, 20 years old, she read from her mental files, not needing to check any list. Shrapnel wounds to the torso and arms. He's recovering, should make a full recovery. His uniform needs extra care around the chest area. That's where his body armor saved his life, but the blood soaked through. Martinez, who had mocked her outdated uniform earlier, watched her work with something approaching awe. You know all their stories? I make it my business to know, Grace replied. When you're washing someone's blood out of their clothes, the least you can do is know their name, their story. They bled for something. That deserves respect, even if all I can offer is clean fabric. The emergency responders had finished their assessment, declaring the facility temporarily closed for repairs. The damaged valve would need replacement, the entire system would need inspection. It would be at least 48 hours before normal operations could resume. What about the uniforms? Grace asked Morris. We have 300 pieces that need processing before 1,400 hours. The medical transport families will be here. Morris started to speak, probably to say the uniforms would have to wait, but Patterson cut him off. We'll set up a temporary facility. Bring in portable units. Chief Miller, you'll supervise the operation. Whatever you need, you'll have. Harrison, who had been silent for several minutes, finally found the courage to speak. "Chief Miller, what I said, what I did, there's no excuse. I'm ready to face whatever disciplinary action—" "There won't be any disciplinary action," Grace interrupted. "You saw someone you thought was disrespecting the uniform, and you acted to protect its honor. Your methods were wrong, but your intentions were understandable. But maybe next time, ask questions before making assumptions." "That's too generous," Harrison protested. "I humiliated you. You gave me the opportunity to save 40 lives," Grace countered. "If you hadn't created this confrontation, if all these people hadn't been here, when that valve blew, the morning shift would have been alone. 3 or 4 people maximum. They wouldn't have known what to do. People would have died. So, in a strange way, Lieutenant, your anger saved lives today." It was a generous interpretation, and everyone knew it. But it was also Grace's way of diffusing the situation, of preventing Harrison from facing the full consequences of his actions. It was leadership through mercy, something that couldn't be taught in any military academy. Chen's phone buzzed with notifications. "The video, it's at 200,000 views. People are sharing it everywhere. The Navy's official Twitter just picked it up. They're calling you the Phoenix Chief, saying you're the reason they restructured the entire damage control training program." Grace turned away from the attention, focusing on carefully folding another uniform. The methodical nature of the work seemed to ground her, each precise fold a meditation against the chaos of recognition she'd never wanted. But the world wouldn't let her retreat into anonymity this time. "Chief Miller," Patterson said, his voice carrying the weight of command, but also something deeper, perhaps guilt for not recognizing her sooner. "There's something else you need to know, something that changes everything." The tone in his voice made everyone pause. Even the emergency responders, packing up their equipment, stopped to listen. Patterson pulled out his secure phone, scrolling through classified communications that had been flooding in since the incident. "Naval Command has been trying to reach you for 3 years. The Liberty Dawn incident. There were survivors we didn't know about. Sailors who were listed as killed in action, but were actually taken prisoner by insurgents who intercepted our medical transport." Grace's hands stopped moving. For the first time since the morning began, she looked genuinely shaken. "That's impossible. I saw the manifest. 21 confirmed dead. I held some of them as they— 3 of them survived, Chief. They were held for 15 years before a SEAL team found them during an unrelated operation. They've been asking for you. They say you're the reason they held on. They knew the Phoenix Chief would never leave anyone behind, so they never gave up hope that someone would come for them." The laundry facility, already quiet, became absolutely silent. Grace sank onto a nearby bench, her legs suddenly unable to support her. The weight of 20 years believing she'd failed 21 sailors crashed into the possibility that 3 had lived, had suffered, had waited. "Who?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Petty Officer Marcus Webb, Seaman Janet Torres, and—" Patterson paused, knowing the next name would hit hardest. "Engine room technician David Kim, your apprentice." Grace's composure finally cracked completely. Tears ran down her scarred face as she processed this information. David Kim had been 21 years old, brilliant, with a gift for engineering that Grace had been nurturing. She had recommended him for advanced technical training just days before the fire. She'd carried the guilt of his death for 2 decades. Rodriguez, still reeling from learning about his uncle, stepped forward. "They're alive? Where are they now?" "Walter Reed," Patterson replied. "They have been there for 6 months, recovering. Physical therapy, psychological treatment, reintegration. They refuse to participate fully in their recovery. They keep saying they need to report to their chief first. They need Chief Miller to officially release them from duty on the Liberty Dawn." The crowd parted as Grace stood, her bearing transforming from laundry worker to military leader in an instant. "They're still waiting for orders? For 20 years, Chief. They maintained military discipline even in captivity. The psychologists say it's what kept them sane. The belief that their chief would expect them to maintain standards, that you'd eventually come for them." Harrison, who had been wrestling with his shame throughout these revelations, spoke up. "We could transport you there, military priority. You could be at Walter Reed in 3 hours." Grace looked at the uniform still waiting to be cleaned, then at the faces around her, faces that had gone from mockery to awe to something approaching reverence. "The uniforms, we'll handle them," Elena said firmly. "All of us. We'll make sure every single piece is perfect. It's the least we can do." Chen, still recording, had tears streaming down her face. My followers, they're organizing. They want to help. Veterans from all over the country are messaging, offering to come help with the laundry, to support the families. This isn't just viral anymore. It's becoming a movement. Grace looked around the damaged facility at the people who had witnessed her transformation from invisible servant to decorated hero and made a decision. Captain Morris, I'll need a uniform, a proper one. If I'm going to release my sailors from duty, I need to look like their chief, not a civilian. Morris nodded immediately. Chief Miller, you'll have whatever you need. But Grace wasn't finished. And Lieutenant Harrison will accompany me. Harrison's head snapped up in surprise. Chief, I don't deserve... You're going to learn something, Lieutenant, Grace interrupted. You're going to learn what service really looks like, what sacrifice means beyond medals and recognition. You're going to meet 3 sailors who held on to military discipline in hell itself because they believed in something bigger than themselves. And maybe you'll understand why I choose to wash uniforms instead of wearing medals. Next week, I'll share the story of a nurse at a military hospital who everyone dismissed as too emotional for trauma work, until the day she saved an admiral's life with technique that only Special Forces medics know. Subscribe now so you don't miss it. And if Grace's story has touched your heart, type respect in the comments below. Every like is a salute to those who serve without recognition, who choose humility over glory. The preparation happened quickly. Within an hour, Grace was in a proper Navy Chief Petty Officer uniform, provided from Morris's emergency stores. The dolphins on her chest, the submarine warfare insignia, caught the light. The ribbons Patterson insisted she wear told a story of valor that spanned 2 decades of service. But it was the small phoenix pin, unofficial and handmade, that Grace touched most often. As she prepared to leave, the facility had filled with people. Word had spread across the base faster than any official communication could travel. Soldiers who had never met Grace but had worn uniforms she'd cleaned came to pay respects. The wounded warriors whose bloodied ACUs she'd been tending arrived in wheelchairs and on crutches, insisting on being present. Private First Class Williams, 19 years old with his left leg gone below the knee, rolled forward in his wheelchair. Chief Miller, my uniform, the one you were cleaning when this started. My mom doesn't need to see it clean. She needs to see it exactly as it is, blood and all. It's proof I survived. But thank you for caring enough to try to spare her that pain. Grace knelt to be at eye level with Williams, a gesture that broke protocol but transcended it. Private, your blood on that uniform is honor itself. I'll make sure your mother receives it however you want. But know this. In 5 years of washing uniforms, yours is one I'll remember. Not because of the blood, but because of the courage it represents. The young soldier's eyes filled with tears as he saluted. Grace returned it with precision that 2 decades of civilian life hadn't diminished. Thompson approached next, still rubbing his wrist unconsciously. Chief, I need to ask, when you stopped me from touching your photo, you could have hurt me badly. Why didn't you? Because you're not my enemy, Specialist Thompson. You're a young soldier who made a mistake. I've made plenty of my own. The difference between a good sailor and a great one isn't avoiding mistakes. It's learning from them. Walker, the youngest who'd wanted to call security, stepped forward with his phone. Chief, my dad's on video call. He's retired Navy, served on carriers in the 90s. He says he knows about the Liberty Dawn, says every engineer in the fleet knows your name. He wanted to thank you. Grace spent a moment speaking with Walker's father and watching the young private's face transform as he realized the magnitude of who he'd threatened to have arrested was worth more than any apology. Before leaving for Walter Reed, Grace made one more stop. The base chapel was small, non-denominational, a quiet space where service members of all faiths could find solace. She entered alone, despite offers of company, and knelt before the simple memorial wall that listed base personnel killed in action. 21 names from the Liberty Dawn were etched there. Grace traced each one with her finger, whispering apologies to 18 of them, the ones who were truly gone. Then she carefully took a photo of the 3 names that would need to be removed: Webb, Torres, and Kim. They were alive. After 20 years, she could finally amend her failure record from 21 to 18. The drive to Walter Reed took exactly 3 hours and 17 minutes. Harrison drove while Grace sat in the back, preparing herself mentally for what was to come. Chen had given her a tablet showing the social media explosion. 3 million views and climbing, messages from naval personnel worldwide sharing their own stories of the Phoenix Chief, how her legend had inspired damage control innovations that had saved countless lives. "I don't understand," Harrison finally said, breaking the silence as they approached the hospital. "You're a legend. You could have any position you want in the Navy, even retired. Why choose to wash laundry?" Grace looked out at the passing landscape, considering her words. "Lieutenant, what's the most important part of a rifle? The barrel? The trigger assembly?" "The cleaning kit," Grace replied. "Without proper maintenance, the best rifle in the world becomes useless. I spent 20 years being the rifle, pointed at problems, fired at enemies. Now, I'm the cleaning kit. Less glamorous, but equally necessary." When they arrived at Walter Reed, the hospital staff was waiting. Word had preceded them, and the hallways lined with personnel who'd heard the story. Some saluted, others simply nodded with respect. Grace walked through it all with the same steady pace she'd used in the laundry facility, neither hurrying, nor lingering. The psychiatric ward where her sailors were housed required special clearance. Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to Specialist Chen, met them at the secure entrance. "Chief Miller, I need to prepare you. These three have been through severe trauma. 15 years of captivity, torture, isolation. The only thing that kept them functional was maintaining military protocol among themselves. They've been running their own informal command structure, with Petty Officer Webb as senior. They won't accept that the war is over, that their duty is complete, without word from their commanding officer." "Their chief," Grace corrected softly. "They're waiting for their chief." The doctor nodded. "When they learned you were listed as killed in action, they refused to believe it, said the Phoenix Chief was too stubborn to die. They've been right all along." The room was sterile white, medical equipment monitoring 3 beds arranged in military precision. Even in a psychiatric ward, they had maintained formation. Marcus Webb, now 43, had aged decades beyond his years. His hair, once black, was completely gray. Burn scars covered his arms, not from the Liberty Dawn, but from 15 years of torture. He was sitting at attention in his bed despite clear pain from injuries that would never fully heal. Janet Torres, 39, had lost vision in her left eye and partial hearing from repeated beatings. She'd been the youngest on the Liberty Dawn, barely 18 when the fire happened. Now she looked older than Grace, trauma etched in every line of her face. David Kim, 41, Grace's former apprentice, had suffered the worst physical damage. His hands, once so gifted with machinery, were twisted from repeatedly broken fingers. The insurgents had known he was an engineer and had tried to force him to build weapons for them. He'd refused every time, accepting punishment rather than betraying his oath. When Grace entered, all 3 attempted to stand at attention. Their bodies, broken by years of abuse, couldn't complete the movement, but the effort was there. "Chief on deck," Webb announced, his voice hoarse from damage to his vocal cords. "As you were," Grace said, her own voice thick with emotion. She moved to stand where all 3 could see her clearly. "Petty Officer Webb, Seaman Torres, Technician Kim, I'm here to give you the order you've been waiting for." They looked at her with desperate hope, the kind that had sustained them through unimaginable horror. "Your duty to the USS Liberty Dawn is complete. Your service in captivity has brought honor to the United States Navy. You maintained discipline, refused to break, and upheld your oaths under conditions that would have broken most people. I'm proud to have served as your chief. You are officially released from duty with highest honors." The effect was immediate. Webb, the senior who had held them together, finally allowed his shoulders to drop. Torres began sobbing, the kind of deep body-shaking tears that came from 20 years of held tension finally releasing. But it was Kim who broke Grace's heart. "Chief," he said, his damaged hands trying to form a salute, "I failed the engine room. I couldn't stop the fire. I should have—" Grace crossed to his bed in 2 strides, gently taking his twisted hands in her scarred ones. "David, you saved the entire ship. You manually triggered the fuel cutoff before the fire reached the main tanks. That's why only 21 died instead of 300. You're the reason I could save anyone at all." Kim looked at her with eyes that had seen too much, endured too much, but still held that spark of the brilliant young engineer she'd mentored. "I tried to maintain the knowledge, Chief, even in captivity. I taught the others what you taught me. Damage control, emergency procedures. We practiced in our cells, using sticks and stones to simulate valve controls. I didn't want to forget. The revelation that they'd spent 15 years practicing naval procedures in terrorist prison cells, maintaining not just discipline but actively training, preparing for a return that might never come. It was almost too much to bear. Harrison, who had remained silent in the corner, was visibly shaking. This was sacrifice beyond anything he'd learned at West Point. Service that transcended medals and recognition. 3 sailors who'd maintained their military bearing in hell itself. Not for glory, but because it's what their chief would expect. The visit lasted 3 hours. Grace sat with each sailor individually, learning their stories, their pain, their incredible resilience. She promised to return, to be part of their recovery, to help them reclaim lives that had been stolen. When it was time to leave, all 3 managed to stand, supporting each other, and rendered perfect salutes despite their injuries. Grace returned them with tears streaming down her face. As they drove back to Fort Clay, Harrison finally understood. They held on because of you. Not the medals, not the rank, but you, the person who wouldn't leave them behind. They held on because of duty, Grace corrected. Because of honor, because they're United States sailors. I just happened to be the symbol they attached those values to. When they returned to base, the scene at the laundry facility was extraordinary. The damaged valve had been replaced with record speed, portable washing units had been brought in, and working them were dozens of volunteers, soldiers, civilians, even some of the family members who'd come to collect their wounded warriors' uniforms. Rodriguez was there, having organized work crews with military efficiency. Chen had turned her live stream into a coordination center for volunteers. Martinez was teaching proper uniform care to newcomers. Thompson and Walker had spent hours ensuring every bloodstain was treated with the respect it deserved. Elena approached Grace with tears in her eyes. We finished them all. Every uniform. The families have been informed about who you really are, what you've been doing. They want to thank you, but we told them you would probably prefer to keep working quietly. Grace surveyed the facility, her battlefield for the last 5 years, now filled with people who understood that service came in many forms. Thank you, all of you. Commander Patterson appeared with a manila envelope. Chief Miller, this requires your attention. Inside was a single sheet of paper, aged and official, with a simple message. Phoenix Team reactivation authorized if needed. Your country may call again. Grace read it, then quietly slid it into her pocket. Some things were better left unspoken. As the sun set over Fort Clay, the facility began to empty. The volunteers departed, the families collected their cleaned uniforms, the normal rhythm of military life reasserted itself. But nothing would ever be quite the same. The quiet woman who washed their clothes had been revealed as a legend, and everyone who had witnessed it had been changed. Chen's final live stream showed Grace back at her station, processing a new batch of uniforms from the latest medical transport. She'd changed out of the chief's uniform and back into her worn coveralls. The only indication of the day's events was the Phoenix pin now openly displayed on her collar. Some people think I'm crazy, Chen said to her audience, now numbering in the millions. Going back to washing clothes after all this. But I get it now. Heroes aren't just the ones who rush into danger. They're also the ones who clean up after, who prepare for the next crisis, who serve without glory. Chief Miller taught us that today. As the facility finally emptied, leaving Grace alone with her washing machines and blood-stained uniforms, she pulled out her phone. An encrypted message waited, coordinates and a simple question. Phoenix available for consultation? She looked at the message for a long moment. 3 sailors were alive because she'd trained them well. 30 civilians had been saved because those sailors had continued her mission, even in captivity. The ripples of one person's service spreading outward in ways she'd never imagined. But there was also Williams's uniform to clean, and Anderson's, and dozens of others. Young soldiers who deserved to have their blood treated with dignity, their sacrifice honored even in small ways. Grace typed her response. Phoenix serves where needed, currently needed at Fort Clay Laundry Facility, 0600 to 1800 hours, Monday through Friday, available for consultation after hours. The response was immediate. Understood. Phoenix Team protocols remain in effect. Stay ready. As she started the next load of uniforms, Grace allowed herself a small smile. Today had begun with harassment about stolen valor, and ended with 3 sailors finally free from 20 years of waiting for their chief's orders. Tomorrow, she'd be back to washing blood from fabric, and that was exactly where she wanted to be. The security camera footage, which would be reviewed and analyzed for training purposes, caught Grace's final actions of the day. She pulled out that worn photograph Thompson had tried to destroy, the one showing her younger self with her team. But now, carefully, she added 3 small marks next to 3 faces she'd thought were dead. Webb, Torres, and Kim were alive. Her failure count had dropped from 21 to 18. She looked directly at the camera then, as if knowing people would study this moment, and spoke clearly. Service isn't about the uniform you wear or the medals you earn. It's about what you do when no one's watching, when there's no glory to be gained. Every person who walked through these doors today learned that. Some serve with rifles, some with scalpels, some with washers and dryers, but we all serve. As she worked into the evening, alone again in her domain of steam and soap, Grace noticed something different. The uniform seemed lighter somehow, as if the secret she'd carried for 5 years had been weighing them down too. Or perhaps it was that now, when she cleaned blood from fabric, she wasn't just anonymous hands doing necessary work. She was Chief Grace Miller, the Phoenix Chief, choosing to serve in the most humble way possible. The phone buzzed once more. Another encrypted message, this one with an attached image. It showed a naval ceremony from earlier that day, 3 names being officially removed from the Liberty Dawn Memorial Wall because 3 sailors had returned from the dead. Webb, Torres, and Kim would need years of recovery, but they were alive, and that changed everything. Grace touched the Phoenix pin on her collar, thinking of the 3 sailors who'd kept faith for 20 years, of the 18 who hadn't made it home, of the thousands of uniforms she'd cleaned and would continue to clean. Tomorrow there would be more blood, more families, more quiet service without recognition. But tonight, for just a moment, she allowed herself to remember that sometimes the greatest service comes not from those who seek glory, but from those who choose to wash away the blood, one uniform at a time, carrying others' burdens in the most literal way possible. The last frame of security footage showed Grace Miller, the Phoenix Chief, the woman who had saved 37 sailors and inspired 3 to survive 15 years of captivity, carefully folding a private's uniform with the same precision she'd used to shut down a catastrophic steam explosion. Her hands, scarred from pulling sailors from flames, now gentle with fabric that bore witness to sacrifice. The industrial laundry facility had returned to its familiar rhythm, the steady hum of machines, the soft whoosh of steam, the quiet efficiency of work that mattered more than most would ever know. Grace moved through her domain with the same methodical grace she'd displayed that morning, before the world had discovered who she really was. The blood-stained uniform in her hands belonged to Sergeant Patricia Hayes, 26 years old, wounded in a mortar attack near Kabul. Grace knew her story, as she knew them all. Young woman from rural Tennessee, first in her family to serve, engaged to marry a fellow soldier when she recovered. Each fold was a prayer, each crease a promise that someone cared enough to handle this evidence of courage with reverence. The blood had told its story, arterial spray from a shoulder wound, the distinctive pattern of field dressing application, the careful cuts where medics had accessed the injury to save a life. Grace's trained eyes read these details like others might read newspaper headlines, understanding the narrative written in copper-dark stains and torn fabric. The Phoenix pin on her collar caught the overhead lights as she worked, a small beacon that transformed what had once been anonymous labor into something approaching sacred duty. Around her, the massive facility seemed to hold its breath, as if the building itself understood that it now housed not just a laundry worker, but a living legend who had chosen the most humble form of continued service. Grace thought about the faces she'd seen today, Harrison's shock and shame, Rodriguez's tears over an uncle he'd barely known, but whose heroism now gave meaning to his own service, Chen's transformation from mockery to awe. Most of all, she thought about Webb, Torres, and Kim, her sailors who had survived the unsurvivable, because they'd believed their chief would never abandon them. 20 years they'd waited, maintaining discipline in conditions that would have broken others, holding on to faith that had ultimately been rewarded. The encrypted message on her phone remained unanswered for now, coordinates that might lead to another mission, another chance to serve in the shadows where her skills could make the difference between life and death. But those coordinates would wait. Tomorrow there would be more uniforms, more blood to wash away, more families who needed to receive their loved ones' clothes free from the stains of war. As the night deepened around Fort Clay, Grace finished folding Sergeant Hayes' uniform with the same care she'd shown thousands of others. The facility's security cameras captured her solitary figure, moving through pools of fluorescent light, a guardian angel armed with soap and water, protecting the dignity of warriors, one blood stain at a time. She looked up at the camera one final time, as if sensing the weight of history watching her through that electronic eye. Her lips moved in the faintest of smiles, not of triumph or vindication, but of quiet satisfaction in work well done and purpose clearly defined. "Some flames never truly die," she whispered to the empty facility. "They just burn differently."